MSc Performance Football Coaching at St Mary's, University Twickenham, PFC 7001. Expertise and skill acquisition, a constraints-led approach to skill acquisition. Presented by Claudio Gomez, Nicolas Mentakis, and Gavin Murphy. Today we're going to be talking about the acquisition of skill through a constraints-led approach. The attending learning outcomes for this seminar will be distinguishing between technique and skill, identifying what current skill acquisition practice looks like, and what research says about current practice. We will then aim to offer an alternative to skill acquisition practice with a constraints-led approach through an evidence-based research. Firstly, you will see a worksheet in front of you displayed here. As we progress through this seminar, we would like you to fill in this as we go, and we will review it at the end. We need to start with defining the difference between technique and skill. Technique occurs in a closed environment without any external interference. In skill, we are working on technique with interference. Remember, we are trying to acquire a skill. Here is a photograph of David Beckham. We'd like you to think about the type of practice that led him to acquire his unique style of passing. Let's start with a video. How many coaches here want their teams playing like Barcelona? And how many coaches want their teams playing like Burnley? We'd also ask you to try to recognize what skills you can see in this video.
Going forward in terms of goals, but we also know that they have their moments at the back where they just give you a chance.
Busquets slipped into Messi. It's clever with Xavi. It's Messi. It's 1-0. And it's absolutely brilliant Barcelona football.
So how do we go about acquiring skills like passing, dribbling, and shooting? Current practice tends to look a little bit like this. We may have all done practices like this, or we have observed practices like this being delivered. These practices are what research calls block practices. Coaches may call them technical practices or even drills. Here, a player performs a single action repeatedly with the expectation that the player will become proficient at that action. This may not be where the most learning can happen.
You go. Yep.
Research has shown that block practices show a better performance during the practice phase compared to a more random form of practice. So when running practices like this, the improvement we observe may be misleading if our goal is to acquire skill like passing, dribbling, or shooting. There is also an element of control from the coach. because as coaches we love to control. We can observe and assess everyone. This type of practice allows us to control most aspects of what the players are training. However, it has been found that this type of autocratic, coach-centered approach takes ownership and responsibility away from the players. Block practices enable the coach to provide various types of instruction and feedback to players. This is great because it allows us to get in and coach. Getting in and coaching tends to look a little bit like telling a player exactly how a technique should be executed. This is explicit instruction. For the most part, research shows that coaches tend to use explicit instruction more frequently than implicit instruction. Implicit instruction is quite the opposite, where a coach gives very little instruction. But isn't given instruction the essence of coaching? Which moves us on to attentional focus. If players are shown only one technique to achieve the desired outcome, are players likely to search for other techniques within these types of practices? Research shows block practice causes players to focus internally on their technique. That is, the process of the technique, plant foot here, hips facing in the direction you want the ball, knees slightly bent, strike the ball with the side of the foot, head up, unlike the coach displayed in this image here. It should be noted that this research was conducted on throwing techniques and golf putting. You may recall that we had a photograph of David Beckham earlier. Do you think he learned that unique passing skill by being told exactly what to do by his coach? Based on these types of instruction, you get explicit and implicit motor learning, whereby your player may think about the process of executing a skill or technique, which is explicit, or they may execute the skill instinctively, which is implicit motor learning. What way do you want your players learning? A study in 2012 of dual task techniques showed that implicit motor learning demonstrated a greater performance under competition conditions and a greater retention in skill than explicit motor learning. So which way do you want your players learning now? Block practices also assume that everyone learns in the same way, at the same time, and at the same speed. This is what research calls a linear pedagogy. It is also a more coach-centered approach. Linear pedagogy implies that one size fits all. We would ask you, as coaches, do all your players learn the same way? Does Johnny learn at the same rate as Bobby? Referring to the last 3 videos, how much do these practices look like soccer? Do these practices really transfer? We'd like to ask you what you think is missing from those previous 3 videos. How many times in a game does a player play a 10-yard pass? How many times in a game will a player dribble the ball through a set of cones? How many times in a game will a player set the ball to a teammate for a shot? In a seminal paper in 1975, Schmidt wrote that variability in movement was essential to developing more movements to cope with the demands of a specific situation. This idea was later echoed, stating that the variability in practice and movements increase player workspace and a greater opportunity to search and discover laws that organize information and action. This information and how we perceive it and action are incredibly important, as we'll find out later. We would also ask you to think about how we go about increasing the variety in our practices. But going back, what else is missing from those practices? Amongst other things, our defenders. How often in a game are players trying to pass the ball without an opponent trying to take it from them? What else is missing? Choice. If we only have one choice, we only have one decision to make. If we have more choices, we have more decisions. As coaches, we want players to be creative and to make the right decisions in a game. But how can we expect players to make the right decisions at the right time if we don't give them the opportunities to make decisions? In order for us to facilitate developing expert performers, decision making should be at the heart of our practices. What about the area of the field and the moment in the game in which these skills are performed and the decisions are made? Would your centre backs play those types of passes in front of their goal? Would you want your goalkeeper dribbling from his area? Maybe some would. Do you want your central midfielder shooting from 40 yards away? Maybe. The question is how we increase variability, increase the volume of decisions, and introduce realism to our practices.
When learning a new skill, is it better to practice the skill in a repetitive and structured way or in a more random style of practice? Different studies have explored the effects of the organization of practice on the acquisition of a new skill. Two learning conditions are contrasted: high variability condition and low variability condition. The studies that have explored this contrast show that while random practice leads to poorer performance during acquisition than blocked practice, it promotes superior performance, orientation, and transfer of a skill. One of the reasons might be the contextual interference effect. In other words, contextual interference is the introduction of challenges like, for example, defenders, pitch size, or rules, which leads to adaptations that benefit skill learning. Many skill learning principles contain aspects of non-linear pedagogy. Increasingly, according to Chow 2013, non-linear pedagogy approach can be used to support existing skill learning principles. Grounded on ecological dynamics, non-linear pedagogy is a framework that informs coaches to design representative learning environments. Non-linear pedagogy practice is centered in the performer environment system, exhibiting tasks that should be representative of the context of performance with adaptive variability. According to Pinder and others, 2011, in non-linear pedagogy, instructions are regarded as conditions or constraints that guide the participant's search for functional solutions. In addition, instructions in non-linear pedagogy are not prescriptive or authoritarian, but facilitators of discovery and so able to strengthen the relations between coach and player while promoting autonomy. In non-linear pedagogy, task constraints are manipulated to guide participants' actions to the intended goals. Chow and colleagues 2011 suggested that exploration of appropriate solutions is facilitated by manipulation of goals, practice space, and equipment, also rules in sports and learning game scenarios. We mentioned before that non-linear pedagogy is grounded in ecological dynamics. The ecological dynamics is a framework that informs the acquisition of skill in microenvironments. Moreover, early diversification of sport environments, for example constraints-led approach, Ranganathan and Newell 2013, suggested might promote skills transfer between those environments and results in emergent behaviors. The ecological dynamics framework proposes a modified three stages learning model: search and exploration, discovery and stabilization, exploitation. In Ecological Dynamics, Warren 2006 and Seifert and colleagues 2019 captured the link between perception and action systems that we will talk about later in this seminar by describing how interacting constraints support the information-based regulation of action. So, what are we looking for in a sporting context from an ecological perspective? We are looking at dynamic and varying relationship between individuals, the task, and the environment. Observing the relationships might look like chaos. Coaches watch the players learn through negotiating the dynamics of these relationships. By embracing ecological dynamics, we understand the value of learning through relationships, the nonlinear nature of development, and the importance of coaches' role as facilitators and observers of all these relationship complexities. All this information leads us to the constraints-led approach. So, what is constraints-led approach? According to Renshaw and colleagues 2016, the constraints-led approach is an ecological model centered on the mutual relationship that emerges from interactions of each individual and the performance environment. Moreover, the same author mentioned that the constraints-led approach has arisen from the umbrella of nonlinear pedagogy emerging from the framework of ecological dynamics. Thus, nonlinear pedagogy and the constraints-led approach share some key principles that guide the coach to create an environment with opportunities for action which every individual can learn to achieve their task goals. These principles are realism in the practice we deliver, manipulations of task constraints, increased variety for the player and the practice, information movement couplings or perception action couplings, as we will find out, and finally, the modification of instruction and feedback that we give to our players. Araujo and colleagues 2004 mentioned that in the constraints-led approach, learner behaviors in sports and coaching context need to be channeled by manipulations of interacting constraints. According to Lee et others 2014, task, individual, and environmental constraints, as you can see in the image, are considered and manipulated to guide the performer through a learning process according to the individual differences, promoting decision making. Renshaw and colleagues 2010 highlighted the importance of coaches' role in designing task constraints which facilitate emergent knowledge and understanding of a performance environment through perception and actions. The interactions of constraints facilitate the emergence of behaviors like thoughts, ideas, actions, and perceptions in every individual. In the constraints-led approach, the focus is on learning skills by using task simplification in environments that are representative of the performance environment. We have previously mentioned the word constraints and how much they affect a sporting environment. Therefore, how can we define constraints and what kind of effects are they having on learners? According to Newell 1986, constraints have been defined as boundaries which shape the emergence of behavior from a learner seeking a more comfortable situation. The interaction of different constraints guides the learner to seek effective movement patterns during goal-directed activity. Parsons et others 2006 mentioned that constraints can shape the emergence of movement pattern cognitions and decision-making process in players. Key information that guide actions in present and the technical skills should be easily acquired through manipulations of key task constraints such as goals, boundary playing areas, rules of the game, opponent, teammate, equipment used, and the information sources present in specific performance contexts. Can you think of ways to manipulate the tasks using these constraints? Some examples are the number of goals, the size of the pitch, touch limits, the number of players involved, use of bibs, 6 seconds to win the ball back, and analogies. Coaches have more control over how tasks can be manipulated in contrast with individual and environmental constraints. Appropriate and creative manipulation of task constraints can direct players to acquire specific movement solutions. We also have individual constraints such as their psychology, like emotion and motivation, their level of playing experience, as well as anthropometrics like their height, weight, speed, and strength. Environmental constraints are physical and sociocultural in nature and are relatively time independent. Different surfaces and the way that might influence performance can help in a better understanding of the effects of different physical environmental constraints. Sociocultural differences in the way movements are executed might be an environmental constraint that has an impact on performance and learning in skill acquisition. Sociocultural factors in sport include family support networks, peer groups, societal expectations, and support for young athletes involved in these sports. While some coaches might use the constraints-led approach in their practice, Rains and Chow 2019 mentioned that the complicated language associated with the constraints-led approach makes it difficult for coaches to understand of the key principles and concepts of the constraints-led approach, leading to poor implementation. Therefore, we have tried to present a simplified view of the approach displayed. Moving on to perception-action coupling, where the performer perceives the information, in this case from the constraints, and then performs an action adapting to the perceived information. If we consider contextual interference effect, which is the introduction of opposition, for example, as we mentioned, associated with the constraints-led approach, the player is faced with several choices or decisions. Therefore, decision-making is strongly influenced by the detection and use of contextual information. According to Chow and colleagues, 2015, the constraints-led approach describes the acquisition of decision-making skill which is dependent on the influence of task, individual, and environment. This process results in the performance, emergent behavior, or the acquisition of the skill.
So, in practical terms, how do we apply a constraints-led approach in our context? Focusing on the 3 skills identified in the previous videos, passing, dribbling, and shooting, we will now show some practical examples. A constraints-led approach passing practice. The skill we are focusing on is passing, so how can we constrain the practice for this behavior to emerge? Using constraints-led approach, we designed this 6v6 game with end zones. It is a directional game where the objective is to pass the ball to the teammates in the respective end zone in order to score. As previously mentioned, the easiest constraints to apply are task constraints. In this game, we would use the pitch size combined with the number of players, as well as the scoring rule, to constrain the task. Using a slightly populated and not very large area might increase the number and variety of passes being performed before having the chance to score, where a passing behavior would also emerge due to the scoring constraints. An individual constraint could be the player anthropometrics by purposely selecting one team with the taller or stronger players. In a study from 2017, Moreira and colleagues suggested that in practice games, the physical aspect contributes to better performance, specifically on the number of tackles. This might reduce dribbling and increase the passing attempts of the team that we are focusing on, due to their thought higher difficulty on holding on to the ball against physically stronger players. This constraint could lead to players having to adapt their game, like for example the players in the earlier video, Xavi and Iniesta, who had to adapt their game due to their size. As previously noted, the environment is far more difficult to constrain. Our suggestion would be to move practice from a grass pitch to indoors. Using a surface without grass might enable the ball to move quicker and possibly increase the passing attempts. With the way the practice is displayed in the image, we believe it would give players the chance to alternate between short, medium and long passing. So, a question for you is, how would you constrain the practice if you wanted to focus on short passing only? Our suggestion includes using task constraints such as using a smaller area or increasing the number of players, as having less space to play might result in increased number of short passes. According to Nakayama in 2008, this can enhance decision-making ability even though the percentage of successful passes might be smaller. However, Casamichana and Castellano in 2010 suggested that coaches should carefully consider the size of the area, as less skilled players could benefit more from a larger area with larger distances between the players, allowing free space to make decisions, as well as more time to carry out their actions, while more skillful players might benefit more from reduced field dimensions. Therefore, size of the area and number of players need to be carefully considered in order to meet the players' needs. A constraints-led approach dribbling practice. To practice dribbling, we designed a 5v5 directional game where the objective is to dribble the ball to the respective end zone. To promote dribbling, we constrain the practice in various ways. The task constraints include rules and pitch size combined with number of players. However, pitch size and number of players need to be carefully planned, as less space available might promote more passing than dribbling. Dribbling behaviors will also emerge when attempting to score by dribbling to the end zone. An individual constraint we would use is the speed of the players by purposely having the fastest players in the focus team. Having a lower contextual interference, meaning slower defenders, might give the faster players more success on dribbling, possibly leading to more dribbling actions. The environmental constraint chosen could be playing on wet grass. With the ball moving faster, the slick nature of the surface might promote more dribbling opportunities. A constraints-led approach shooting practice. For the final of the free skills, we designed a constrained game where we play a 5v5 including goalkeepers and 2 11-a-side goals. Once again, the size of the area, the number of players and the rules are task constraints that lead us to emergent behaviors. Having a small area not very populated can possibly provide players with a large amount of shooting opportunities. A rule that could promote shooting could include giving players 1 point simply for shooting, 2 points when hitting the target, and 3 points when scoring a goal. For individual constraints, we can purposely select stronger players to be in the same team, who are thought to having the ability to put more power in their shots, possibly giving them the idea that they can shoot from anywhere in the playing area, increasing this way the volume of shooting. The length of the grass could represent an environmental constraint, as longer grass might reduce passing and dribbling attempts, which could result in emerging shooting behaviors. But honestly, who wants to wait for the grass to grow? We previously talked about skill performance and what is involved. So how and why would these three activities be beneficial to acquiring the suggested skills? As seen, constraints-led approach is centered on the relationship that emerges from interactions of each player and the performance environment. This enables players to individually and actively explore and generate solutions to satisfy the task, individual, and environmental constraints imposed. The continuous interactions of the constraints facilitate the emergence of behaviors in each player, for example, thoughts, ideas, actions, and perceptions. The interaction with these constraints allows a focus on the individual differences between players. But not only that, constraints-led approach also focuses on the interactions that emerge in teams, following collective exploration and discovery, which a player cannot find out for him or herself. By providing the players with learning and training opportunities that encourage self-organization under the constraints, increases variety and promotes perception-action coupling, supporting skill acquisition when going through the searching, discovering, and exploiting phases. Using constraints-led approach, we provide our players with high amounts of information in game context, increasing opportunities for action, making this type of practice more relevant to the acquisition of skill. Therefore, manipulating the constraints is considered a very useful tool for coaches to recreate game situations, contributing to players' skill acquisition. We would now like to ask you, how would you design a constraints-led approach practice involving all three skills that have been covered so far? The practice we propose is a 6v6 game including goalkeepers and 2 11-a-side goals. To constrain the task, we use space and number of players, providing them with enough passing options due to having 5 other teammates, while also providing enough space for them to attempt dribbling. To promote shooting, we could use a rule where every time the team scored, they kept possession of the ball by restarting the game from their goalkeeper. For an individual constraint, we could focus on the psychology of the players by adding some pressure to win the game, which could be done by having a consequence for losing it, such as having to tidy up the equipment. We are being careful with the consequence we are using, as we don't want it to be seen as punishment, but still having an element to interfere with their psychology, possibly relating to a real game by giving a feeling of pressure at the same time that it gives them an extra motivation to win the game. To constrain the environment, we would use a social cultural element by carefully picking the teams based on culture and team cohesion. This constraint might be significantly harder to apply and requires careful thought and knowledge about your own players, as picking players from different cultures might not have the desirable effect. However, being able to successfully apply this constraint might enhance performance levels and ability to perform the desirable skills. We would like you to watch this video once more and ask, do you feel better prepared to coach your team to play this way?
Going forward in terms of goals, but we also know that they have their moments at the back where they just give you a chance.
Busquets slipped into Messi, it's clever with Xavi, it's Messi, it's 1-0. And it's absolutely brilliant Barcelona football.
In conclusion, a number of researchers consider that block practice, a linear and coach-centered approach, is not as beneficial for skill learning as a random form of practice such as constraints-led approach. Reasons for these suggestions include the fact that there is no significant decision-making, contextual interference, or variability included in block practice. And although it might promote better performance in practice, it does not enhance long-term learning. Moreover, it tends to train technique rather than skill. We also saw that in contrast, constraints-led approach can include high volumes of decision-making aspects, contextual interference, and variability, leading to skill acquisition and long-term retention through the use of constraints. It is also worth mentioning that this approach allows players to develop while promoting higher levels of enjoyment, dedication, and autonomy. To constrain the practice, coaches can use task, individual, and environmental constraints. However, the use and frequency of the constraints should be well considered so that the acquisition of skill can be effective over the years of training. This means that the coach plays an important role on designing the sessions and respective constraints in order to facilitate the intended behaviors and long-term learning. Referring back to the worksheet we gave you at the start and asked you to fill in, we would now like to assess your understanding about the topic. We hope this presentation gave you the knowledge and understanding to deliver a constraints-led approach practice in one of your next sessions. Does the constraints-led approach lead to skill acquisition? In agreement with research, we suggest that it does, when wisely applying the constraints and careful consideration of instruction and feedback. However, you should also consider the context you work at, as one size does not fit all.